Hello, welcome to the podcast Sustain, Change and Grow. Hi Mario, very nice to have you here, and I'm looking forward to discussing with you the renewables and also the economics of the renewables, which is closely related to your research.
Hi, Dilara. Very pleased to be here with you. Thanks for the invitation.
And let us start with a short introduction from your side.
So my name is Mario Samano, and I am an associate professor of economics at HEC Montreal. Um, so I do research on economics, particularly on the economics of energy markets. And lately, I've been spending quite some time thinking about electricity markets and lots of connections with renewables and other topics.
Let's move directly into the topic and saying so what the energy is, so why we need it, and why there is such a buzz about the renewables.
It can be very technical, but there are also many ideas that are very intuitive about this market. Energy is very basic in all of our lives. Basically, everything we do requires energy. And the energy that I want to be talking about, that I will talk about in my research, is the energy that we produce as humans through technological processes. And so we use this energy for all sorts of industries, but in our daily life, we use energy for heating our houses, for cooling our houses, for charging our devices, our computers, our phones, to drive our cars. So we use either gasoline or we use electricity to charge our cars. Energy is everywhere. And that's why I think it's a very, very important topic to think about, to study, think about what's going to happen to all sorts of topics about energy into the future.
Yeah, so what different types of energy do we use?
People talk about primary sources of energy, focus on energy types that directly affect our daily lives. I'm talking about electricity. I'm thinking about oil, natural gas. And so these forms of energy get transformed into either heat or cooling or transportation, basically movement. Each one of these types of energies can have a lot of geopolitical constraints, a lot of technological constraints. And in some of these forms of energy, we have seen in the recent decades a lot of progress, a lot of disruption from new technologies. So in particular in electricity, that's the industry that I follow the most. One of the main disruptors has been the use of renewables, basically the introduction of solar and wind power into the production of electricity.
Yeah. So maybe just like in a very general words. So the energy is a measure of how we transform the world, right? So it can be heating, so the change in the temperature. It can be speed, so the change of speed. It can be the change in the some chemical processes or chemical structure. So energy is our impact on the environment, right? So we start from the divine environment, we apply certain energy, and we modify the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So I totally agree with you. So every time that we try to extract energy from chemical processes, as you mentioned, or from kinetic sources, like when we use wind to produce energy, we are having an impact on the environment. Absolutely. Right? So I think that what we need to keep in mind is, in general, is that there is always a trade-off. There is always a trade-off between not using energy versus using energy, between using a particular source of energy and a different source of energy. And these trade-offs will be less or more impact to the environment, higher costs, or lower monetary costs for consumers.
Yeah, so basically the simplest energy that we can use is the energy of our muscles, right? So we can dig a hole, or we can construct something, and we do just our own muscles, and we are just X% efficient, right? Then we can use horses then this is a little bit more efficient, or we can use the machines. And so the machines is now the most efficient form of the transformation. It has the biggest impact with the least effort, let's say.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we ourselves produce energy, as you said, and over time, throughout the history of humanity, right, we have transitioned from doing everything by ourselves with our own hands to the point now that we delegate a lot of those activities to the machines. But that transition, of course, has required huge amounts of energy expedite those processes.
Basically, now everything we do, from the clothes we wear, from the food we eat, from the devices we use. So behind everything of this, there are the machines that will use the energy in different forms, right? So it can be coal, it can be oil, it can be electricity. Well, though electricity is not in a way independent, for the moment behind, there are also coal, oil, or gas, right? So that's how we produce electricity. It's not an independent source of energy. Or it can be renewables.
That's right. So electricity is not a primary source of energy. Electricity is produced using different sources, a variety of sources. And you mentioned a few: natural gas, oil, coal, but also renewables, and also hydropower. And all of these forms of energy have different consequences for the environment, and they also have different costs of production. These costs and these impacts to the environment will depend largely on the geography of the place where you're trying to produce this electricity.
So maybe let's give some specifics about the renewables. What is the definition that we use for the renewable energy?
Renewables are sources of energy that can be found in nature. They cannot be depleted, right? So what I mean by that is that if you want to use, for example, coal to produce electricity, you have to find a mine, a place where you can extract coal from the ground. But eventually, even if those mines contain huge amounts of coal, eventually you're going to run out of it. Eventually, you're going to extract everything that is underground that has this particular material. And so we think of renewables as a source of energy that is not that doesn't have an end, at least over long periods of time. And so the two primary examples of that are wind and solar, because the sun is a huge source of nuclear power, basically, that has been running for quite some time. And as any star is going to have an end, but for the purposes of our planning span of life, we are confident that the sun will keep providing energy to our planet. And then wind, because of all the climate in the planet, we also have basically an endless source of movement with wind. So people define renewables as the sources that are not depleted, at least in foreseeable future.
We know that non-renewable energy, like the coal, oil, gas, they are unequally distributed across the world. What can we say about the renewables? Is it something that could be much more equal or democratic?
Yeah, no, absolutely, you're right. So there is a huge idiosyncratic component in who has more resources of any type, right? And we can say the same about traditional sources of energy. Some countries have more access to coal than others. Some countries are very rich in oil. And some countries also have higher amounts of solar irradiation. Some areas have more wind. And so that creates an exogenous source of dispersion in the amount of renewables. And I think you're pointing out to something very, very important, which is it is given already in a manner that we cannot control. A large amount of variation in how much renewables we can harvest depending on where we are in the world. That doesn't mean that we cannot use renewables around the world, but that will require that in some parts of the world, the technologies will have to become more efficient.
And what are the benefits of the renewables?
So the main attraction of renewables is that it's a form of producing electricity that does not have greenhouse gas emissions attached to the production of the electricity. So what I mean by the production is that once the solar panels are installed or once the wind turbines are installed, the production of the electricity coming from those devices does not use any emissions. The production of electricity, but is that the production of the devices themselves most likely used industrial processes that had emissions associated with.
We will get into this about the life cycle emissions and the impact. We need renewables essentially to be able to reduce the use of the more traditional fossil fuel energies. So, because those are associated with a huge carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. And so, in order to remain within the 1.52 degrees increase of the temperature, we really need to cut our emissions and to get to net zero, ideally, by 2050. At least that's what is envisaged. So for this, we need renewables. Like, how much do we need renewables to replace, and how feasible this is? And maybe just another question: does the use of the renewables assume that we need to electrify basically everything? Because what the renewables produce is the electricity, right? And so we need to move to the electric vehicles. We need to heat with electricity. We need to use electricity for the industries, right? So when we previously used all kind of different sources for different purposes, right? So we use coal for heating, we use oil for vehicles, we use gas for heating again. So now we're moving everything into the just electricity, and we have to electrify all the processes. Is that the right?
That is absolutely correct. The first part of your question, how much space we need, how feasible this is, right? So let's think about the extreme case. So let's think about we don't want to have any electricity produced by sources that have emissions associated with our production, right? So let's say we don't want natural gas, we don't want coal to produce our electricity. So what are the alternatives? Renewables is one alternative, nuclear is one alternative, and can we switch? The question is, can we switch completely to a 100% renewables supply for electricity? And most likely the answer to that is no, we cannot. And the reason for that is a property of renewables that is called the intermittency. And that is simply means that we cannot completely forecast or control how much solar irradiation we have and the speed of the wind. And so that's really at the core of the most problematic feature of renewables. So we cannot do 100%. So how much can we do to get to a feasible solution? We will need a combination of renewables and some other form of energy. Recently, in 2022, the NREL, a think tank in the US that produces reports on energy, published a report where they calculated how much surface in the US would be needed to produce electricity using renewables and still comply with the policies in place to keep climate change at bay. And so they found that actually the surface of the US you will need to install solar panels and wind turbines is not a huge amount, right? The surface is comparable to the surface that is already being used for railroads, for example. in the US. And so, of course, this answer changes from one place to the other, once again, because this is connected to how much wind you have, how much solar you have in that in a specific region. But I think that is a relief to know that if we want to electrify anything, if we want to switch to renewables, it's not going to cost us a huge amount of surface. It's something that I think it's good to point out, and that it's basically doable.
So I have in mind a chart which shows the evolution of the energy use over time. And essentially, what it shows is that we have never replaced one energy source by another. So it has always been an accumulation of different energy sources, right? So initially, we used bio sources like forest. Then we started using coal. Then we added oil. Then we added gas. Then we added renewables. But it has always been just the accumulation. And the reason is that the energy use is essentially correlated with the GDP, so the gross domestic product, with everything that we produce in a country, in the world. And the GDP has been growing over the last 50, 70 years, essentially exponentially. So does the energy use. And I want to trust the scientists who say that we can replace the all the energy we use from the traditional sources by the renewable energy. But truly speaking, I just have a difficulty to imagine this.
Yeah. No, I completely see what you're saying, and it's also due the phenomenon that you're describing. I think it's also due to the fact that population keeps increasing, right? So even if we keep our energy consumption per capita constant, just the fact that we are more human beings now than 50 years ago, that has increased our needs for energy.
Can I just make a comment here? This is true. The number of people has grown exponentially as well. We have reached 8 billion. But the use of the energy is not at all equally distributed across the planet. So, with I believe the Western countries being responsible for probably 70, if not more, percent of the energy use. So, for this reason, I think when I hear the argument, "Oh, the population has been growing," like I think there is a bit of dishonesty. Who is actually using this energy?
Yes. No. I totally agree that it's very dispersed again. There's a lot of variation on energy consumption around the world, and it is true, absolutely true, that in many places around the world, people have a low access to energy, and in other places, people have had an increase in access to energy over time. And so some people might want to think about what the industry calls the demand side management policies to try to put at bay the consumption of energy from some consumers. If I may, so one footnote on this is that I think that in electricity markets, one mistake that has been done is that we as consumers don't see the true cost of the electricity. We live in a world in which we get our bill at the end of the month or every 2 months, and basically for most consumers it's just a flat rate, right? But the electricity has a different cost at different hours of the day, at different days of the week, and we as consumers we're not exposed to the price. If we were exposed to the price, I think that we will be more rational about how much energy to use.
Let's take it for granted the fact that we have enough surface to install enough solar and wind plants to produce the electricity. So how much money do we need?
The short answer is a lot of money. There are several examples of places where we can see that the industry itself has not been able to sustain the large installation costs relative to how much money they can make by selling electricity using solar panels or wind turbines. And what has happened in many places around the world is that governments have stepped in to help this transition. And the way they step in is through policies like subsidies, other incentives to developers to help finance this installation costs. And so that's something that I've been doing in my research for the last 6 or 7 years. How different governments have designed successfully or unsuccessfully different schemes to 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 promote this transition. Now,
Can I just ask a very naive question? So I hear often that the renewable energy is now the cheapest energy on the market. And so this doesn't square really with what you say, that we need a lot of investments and that the companies actually need the government subsidies to be able to operate it. So could you explain how does it work?
yes, yes. So this is a super important point, right? So there are two types of costs in any uh, 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 industrial process. So there are the fixed costs. So this is when you buy and build your installation, when you pay the workers to install the solar panels, when you rooftop or in a large installation out in the desert. For the wind turbines, is the fixed costs are the cost of actually buying the turbine and installing it. And then there is the marginal cost. This is how much it actually costs to produce electricity, one unit at a time, one additional unit. The renewables have this strange property that the fixed costs, so the cost of installing the devices, is really high. That cost keeps going down, but it's still relatively high. On the other hand, once these devices are installed, the cost of producing one more unit of electricity is almost zero. Why? Because wind and solar radiation are free, and that's really the I think where people have different ideas on. Some people belong to the camp that says we should go for renewables because the costs are very low. That is absolutely true on this cost of production once the machines are installed. But the people that say the costs are very large is because they are thinking of the cost of installing the solar panels or the wind turbines.
Mm-hmm. But I imagine when costs of different energies are compared, so I imagine the comparison goes about the total cost, right? So you combine basically the free cost of using the solar and wind and the cost of installation, and you get some sort of a whatever average number, and then the same is done for the other sources, right? So like, and then maybe if you compare it over the full life cycle, then still the renewable energy is cheaper than the traditional energy or electricity rather, let's say.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So that calculation that you just described has even a special name because it's so important. People refer to it as the LCOE, which stands for something slightly technical. It stands for levelized cost of electricity. And so it does exactly what you just described, which is to levelize all these fixed costs that happen in the beginning, and it distributes those costs over time to get an idea of how much it's going to cost on average my production of electricity, and that way I can compare different sources. And so when you look at renewables levelized costs, this cost change a lot from one region to another because it will depend on how much electricity can actually be produced in one region or another. So if you're in a region where there is a lot of solar irradiation, your output is going to be so large that then your benefits are going to outweigh your costs, basically. Uh, but there are going to be regions in which you install the same solar panels, but the solar irradiation is so low that your output is going to be low, and then that's not going to outweigh your your installation cost. Another thing that people do is to compare these technologies using this measure with traditional sources of energy like natural gas and coal and nuclear. And what has happened over time, if you look at these numbers, is that uh, renewables were extremely costly about 20 years ago, but they have followed a downward trend over time. And so that levelized cost of electricity is now more comparable or even lower in some regions to other sources of electricity like natural gas. And so that has changed quite a bit the structure of electricity markets because now renewables uh, are, are competing in a more in a closer manner to conventional sources. Now, going back to the government subsidies, uh, if you have the government presence and the government is giving money to these renewable sources, renewables suppliers, that levelized cost will go down even faster. And that's exactly what the government wants. And so that creates an artificial sort of incentive for investors to put more money on the renewables. But you're absolutely right. We need to think about a way to distribute a measure that distributes the fixed cost into uh, um, the production of electricity over time.
It would be interesting that you dig deeper into the problems with the renewables. Like you mentioned intermittency storage, and I imagine the government policies and subsidies are also very important with respect to overcoming these issues.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So as you said, we already briefly talked about intermittency, and so this is just that we cannot fully forecast how much sun irradiation, how much wind we will have at a given point in time. Then the second problem that we haven't talked about yet is that electricity cannot be stored, and this is true before renewables became an important source of electricity, but it has become a bigger problem these days because we obtain more energy from solar during the middle of the day because that's when the sun has the strongest amounts of radiation. But in most markets, in most countries, we tend to use more electricity towards the end of the day. And so that creates a natural problem in which the demand is shifted towards late hours of the day, but renewables have a peak of production in the middle of the day. So the problem is how to bring those two peaks together if possible. The most promising solution is storage. Now, I'll go back to the storage solution in a second, but the other solution that people have tried, but quite unsuccessfully, is demand side management. So that is try to make people to use less electricity overall, or try to make people use less electricity at the same time towards the end of the day and bring that electricity at times when we have more renewables production. But going back to the storage, so this is I will say, the second wave in the renewables industry. So the first wave was just the development and the deployment of solar and wind sources. But now we want to store that energy. And so people have been working on two different technologies, one older than the other one. The first one is pumped storage. So this is done a lot in Europe, where you have two dams, and you uh, use electricity when the electricity is cheap to pump up water to a reservoir up in the mountains. And when the price of electricity is high, you can release that water and produce electricity and sell it. And so that creates a natural battery for electricity. In other markets, in a much newer technology, is to use chemical batteries, like the ones that you can find on your phone, on your computer, on your car, your electric car. And they put these battery packs together in larger scale, and they work as a giant battery to absorb energy from renewables uh, when they have an excess of electricity that they can later be used at peak hours of demand. And so that has had that has increased the value of renewables because now we hope that uh, renewables and storage can be complementary in some way, right? And so by increasing the value of renewables, that increases investment, and hopefully that will increase our um, and that will decrease our dependency on conventional sources like natural gas and coal.
What about the concentrated solar power installations?
Right. So there are different ways to harvest the solar energy. Uh, so I've been mentioning only the solar panels, but you're right, there are other technologies. And so one of them is the concentration power solar. So this is imagine a tall tower with liquid on the top of this tower, like imagine a, 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 a bowl or a pocket at the top of the tower with some special liquid. And then this tower is surrounded by concentric circles of mirrors, kind of mirrors that reflect the 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 the, the, the sun light into this focal point, which is this bucket, this bowl that is on top of the tower. And so this liquid gets very hot. It gets very hot. It produces a steam and produces steam, and that steam moves a turbine on the top of this tower. And that turbine movement produces electricity. So that has been tried in Arizona, that has been tried in Morocco, in Saudi Arabia, large installations. Uh, and they were promising in the 2010s, perhaps. But what has changed in the industry is that the cost of producing solar panels has decreased to the point that solar panels on a levelized basis are cheaper than the concentrated solar power solar. So uh, we see less and less investments in concentrated power solar than in solar panels. Then I think that nowadays everybody agrees that solar panels are cheaper. And another thing about concentrating solar power is that it uses a lot of surface, right? It uses a huge amount of surface to install these mirrors and reflect the light. So that's a potential
Yeah,
drawback.
but it stores better and for longer the energy, is it?
Yes, absolutely. So as I said, so it concentrates the light into the top of the tower in this liquid to eventually move a turbine through the steam that comes out of this liquid. And so that's, as you mentioned, that's a form of storage. And so under certain conditions, yes, it works both as a renewable source, but also as storage.
What is about the challenges with the infrastructure? Like, I think this is another common concern is that if we go for the full electrification, that the current if infrastructure, the interconnections won't allow us to do it, and so we actually need to invest even more into changing the network, the energy network.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, and that's a super important problem that the industry and the governments are not sure how to solve. So the problem, just to rephrase it, is that we install wind farms, solar farms, but they need a lot of space sometimes to be installed. And land is expensive. Land is particularly expensive near the cities because the land has other uses that have more value. And so these companies, the solar farms, these wind farms, tend to buy land that is very far from the cities. They install their farms, they produce electricity, but then it becomes a challenge to transport that electricity uh, into the cities where the population is, where you have the electricity demand. Um, and so this infrastructure that you're referring to is the transmission lines. So how do we bring that electricity into the cities? Problem is that a market-based solution is complicated because transmission lines have huge economies of scale. So that means that the average cost of these lines decreases as you install more and more of these lines. And that naturally gives place to a monopoly problem, right? So it's only convenient that there is one firm providing this service. Not many companies want to do this. There is no competition. The companies that exist that do this are heavily regulated, meaning the government doesn't let them increase their prices. The government has a price ceiling on these companies, on these services, but then the profits are low, and then the amount of money that they have to invest in higher capacity and more transmission lines is limited. And so there is this disconnection of we're growing the capacity of renewables. That's great. We have more electricity coming from clean sources, but then there is no practical solution on how to bring that electricity into the cities. So governments have been trying different policies, but it's still unclear.
How this is really different from the problem of the railroads? Because for me, it's somewhat similar. You need to have this, well, transmission lines. You need to have this network of the interconnections, which are railroads or the electricity transmission lines. You certainly gain from the economy of scale. There is a difference between the installation of this how say, of these physical objects, right, of the transmission lines, and the usage, which is the transmission of the energy itself.
Yes, yes.
This was solved well in different countries in different ways. But how different the question is for the renewable energy?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic analogy. And what has happened, at least in the case of North America, for the railroad industry, is that we see more and more mergers over time, meaning that these companies are acquiring smaller companies, and now we have companies that can transport goods all the way from Mexico to Canada on the same on the railroads owned by the same companies. And they do that because, as you said, it's an industry that has huge economies of scale. So the optimal thing to do is to move towards the monopoly situation. Now, what is different, I believe, with the transmission lines in electricity markets is that in the railroad industry, it's a market based industry, meaning that the owners of the railroads can charge any price they want to the consumers, so to the trains that have to use those lines. But in the case of transmission lines for electricity, those lines are heavily regulated. And so the government imposes price ceilings so that these monopolies cannot extract an excessive amount of consumer surplus, because we as society have decided that electricity is such a fundamental good that it needs to be provided in more or less a fair way. And so we need to put a cap on those prices.
I've got another idea, which is at least implemented in France. So to have your internet, you need to use the network as well, right? So it's optic network. And so I believe initially it was each company was doing their own network and they could charge whatever they wanted. But then this network became somewhat mutualized, and any provider could use the existing network to provide its services. And so there are companies which provide much better services and much cheaper using the same network. So I imagine there is a need for, it's certainly not a purely market solution, and you need some government interventions. But it seems to me that there are a lot of similar issues that have already been solved.
Yes, yes, no, that's another excellent analogy, um, and so I think that the industry, the electricity market has already this compatibility, let's call it like that. So there is only one a grid, one transmission line. There are no duplicates, and so in principle, any producer can pay the fees and can use the network. Uh, the problem has been amplified because of what people in the industry call the queuing problem. So you want to install a solar farm, you want to develop a solar farm, and so you have to get approval from many different agencies, government agencies. You have to do environmental studies to prove that you're not going to have a high impact on on the land where you're going to install the solar panels. Um, and so you get into a queue. You get in the line, uh, waiting for the approval of your all the paperwork that you have to do, all the studies, environmental studies that you have to do. And uh, these companies have to wait quite a long time to get all those approvals. And by the time they get the approval, their invested money is almost gone because this happens in a number of years. And so some of these companies decide to in the end not develop the solar farm that they had promised. So that's the straightforward, or that's the simple case. But recently, I was talking to in Montreal. I was talking to someone who works for a consulting firm in this industry, and he was telling me that there are companies that strategically they get signed up to different queues for different interconnection nodes just to block other competitors from getting access to the network. Right? So this is beyond environmental concerns. This is simply trying to play with the system. And so there is a lot of space, I believe, for setting a good set of rules in how to connect the renewable sources, the sites, with the cities through transmission lines. But it seems that currently the system that we have in different countries to do this is leaving a lot of space for gaming the system and ultimately for not having a prompt uh, interconnection that will bring the electricity into the cities from clean sources.
So, meaning that the governments have work to do, not only providing the subsidies, but also a level playing field for all the actors and simplifying simplifying, changing, improving the regulation to facilitate the access of many actors. And probably that's one of the places where the competition could work pretty well to improve the costs and also the scale of the solution.
Yeah, so I think that there are places where government can play an important role, and I think that this is one of those places. Uh, but let's recall that competition here is difficult because it's an industry with very high fixed costs, and so it produces what is called a natural monopoly. Economies of scale are so large that it is just not convenient, it is not optimal to have more than one company providing these services. So I think that we have to keep in mind that, and that we have to live with the fact that these services will need to be provided by a monopolist, and that therefore we need the government intervention to keep the prices that these monopolists will charge at bay.
It seems there should be some sort of a mixed solution between the market economy, market approach, and also the well, probably the government, right? So maybe the government should be in charge of building the lines, right? So of building the railroads with the contribution of the market participants, but then the delivery of the services of producing the energy could be outsourced to the market, where actually the market could play a role this time more in the competition and searching for better solutions and for gaining the efficiency.
Yeah, so this is a question that has been in my head over the past few months. So in my recent work, that is this interconnection problem in Germany, different characteristics than the north in terms of wind and solar production. So in Germany, they have tried to build interconnection lines to move electricity between the north and the south. So we've looked into that, and we've run some we've calculated some cost benefit analysis regarding that and how costly it will be to install these transmission lines. And I agree with you that in the absence of a market-based mechanism, it's crucial to understand how much the government can do here. And so I agree with your idea that if somehow we had the network being provided, let's say, government or by some other entity, and then the different users of this network could, in principle, pay a fee that will allow for the maintenance of those transmission lines, but in a way that the different producers and the different consumers on the other side could use the same network, and the network becomes just a platform that different agents can use, right? And so in that sense, I guess that the question is, what is the right amount of money to charge for a fair use of that network?
I don't have the answer, but it seems to me it's the second order question. So it's not changing the equilibrium, or like it's a matter of calibrating it.
Yeah, I think it's something close to that. I think that we know more or less what needs to be done, but we need to agree to a number that is fair for everyone.
Is there anything else that you would like to add on the government's policies before we move into the more general issue of the not only climate change but
That's right, a bigger problem, a bigger challenge. So before moving on, I guess I would like to say that renewables are super important, but let's not forget that when large companies get to own wind farms, solar farms, and if they participate in electricity markets, those big companies may try to use their market power to to gain profits. And so even though we have said here in this conversation that renewables are a very low cost technology to produce electricity, if that resource is owned by a large company, the price that they're going to ask for it is not going to be zero. It's going to be something above that, because they want to recoup their costs. I think that it's important to keep that in mind.
And I think it's also very important to keep in mind that, like what you mentioned, the initial investments in the renewables into construction of the plants are actually very high. And so even the rich countries in Europe and in the North America have to subsidize these investments, right? So for this reason, when we talk about the affordability and of the renewables and the necessity of the developing countries undertake the transition, I think it's very important to keep in mind that these countries don't have the same resources. Moral question, like, do we really have, the right in the Western countries to say, okay, you have to undertake the transition, knowing that these resources will be withdrawn from other important areas of the social life, right? So the health, the
Absolutely, I absolutely agree with that.
now let's move to the what I call planetary boundaries, because renewable energy is essentially solving the issue of the climate change, so reducing the carbon emissions, but it is potentially aggravating the problem of the living planetary boundaries. And the real question is how sustainable the renewable energy really is.
That's a super important question for these technologies. Let's not forget that in order to have solar panels, in order to have wind turbines, we have to use all the resources to produce those machines, to produce those devices. And so the question is the damage or the consequences, are the consequences of that production of those devices larger or smaller than the benefits that we get from producing electricity, no emissions, right? And so it's a once again it's a cost benefit analysis that we have to think about. We're producing batteries using lithium, we're producing solar panels using certain compounds that may be dangerous for humans. And so how those damages compare to the benefits of not producing electricity from coal or from natural gas, right?
Let's be just a little bit more specific. So to produce the solar panels, wind turbines, so we need a lot of minerals, right? So we need you mentioned lithium, we need sand, and this is mining. And mining has a huge cost for the environment on the land. It uses a lot of water, which is really a rare resource. And it costs a lot also in terms of the people's safety, health conditions, etc. We really need to focus on all these various aspects. So we need to go, well, first we need to go for life cycle analysis, right? So like from the cradle to the grave. But we also need to take into account not only one dimension, which is the climate change, but all the other dimensions of the environment and of the social side. Actually, with the growth that we have, with the growth, the economic growth, with the growth of the population, I really doubt that we could be sustainable by replacing all the current energy uses of the traditional energy sources by the renewable energy sources.
So to your first point, so the life cycle assessment of these technologies means that we want to measure the total cost, environmental cost from the production of these devices all the way to when they get used to produce electricity. And the example that you mentioned, the extraction of lithium, which gets used for the batteries that we talked about before, the amounts of water they get used for that industry are huge. Typically, they have to pump water into the ground to extract the lithium from deeper underneath. And one may wonder, was that the best use of water? And the answer, I guess, it depends on how much we value the elimination of other industries that we're currently using to produce electricity, namely coal and natural gas. And so there is no free lunch, right?
As economists say.
As economists say. And so I think that it's going to be extremely hard to find a technology that will not have any impact at all in the environment, right? And so if we assume, and this is, I guess, the fundamental thing, if we assume that our consumption of energy will stay at current levels, we will have demand for electricity no matter what. And the best we can do is to try to minimize the environmental impacts of that production. I do not know the answer. I don't know what is the magnitude of the damage of using storage with lithium batteries versus using natural gas to produce electricity whenever we need it. I think that's still an open question because it depends on the geography of the place that you're talking about. Meaning, do they have water nearby or they don't? But those are the questions that we really want to answer, that we want to understand to know the value of these new technologies.
Actually, I would pose the question maybe a bit differently. So for me, it's not the value of the or the cost of the water versus the cost of the emissions. For me, it's actually the cost of either versus the value of using the technology, of using the product or the service that is produced given this cost to the environment, to the to the health, people's health, etc. If you need to use the lithium and the water that will go with it to get your 11th iPhone and to charge it, or you're like, the third car. For me, the question is pretty obvious. Like, probably these costs are way too high to pay for the service you get.
Mm, mm. Yeah, no, I think that goes back right to consumers' preferences in our. We have sort of an addiction to energy. We we have built a very comfortable life that requires a lot of energy. So I think your question is getting at, can we have other solutions such as perhaps reducing our own energy consumption? There is something, this makes me think of something else in electricity markets, in energy markets in general, that is very important, the rebound effect. So we make electricity cheaper or more accessible, and instead of consuming the same amount of electricity or the same amount of energy, we tend to consume more, right? Because it becomes more accessible, cheaper. That's really counteracting all the benefits that we could bring by using renewable sources.
Yeah, I think the best example for me is the airplanes. So it was very inefficient. They were very expensive. We managed to improve the costs multiple times. So what we do? Well, we fly now everywhere. We fly for a weekend from Paris to Barcelona, right? So with all the costs in carbon emissions associated, and also use of these resources are not equally distributed around the world. So there is a part of the world which uses it to a large extent, while the other part sometimes don't have any access to the same energy.
So something that we haven't mentioned at all, but it's behind all these things that we've talked about, is that we live in a world where carbon emissions do not have a price. And in most societies, there is no full acceptance that if we attached a cost, a value per unit of carbon emissions, if you want to fly from Paris to Barcelona, you will need to pay a certain amount of money because of all the emissions associated to that trip. And at that point, people might think twice whether they want to do that trip or not. But we don't live in that world. And so that makes us very light in our decisions.
Yeah, but I think it's not only about the carbon emissions, it's about more generally natural resources. what does it cost? What does lithium cost? What sand costs? What water costs? So we measure it purely in the terms of how much it costs to extract these resources. But how much it really means, for the world, for the environment, for the humans' life, it has no price. And actually, there are some estimations which say that if the company really paid the cost of the natural resources they are using, none of the companies would be profitable.
I totally believe that. I totally believe that.
And that's, for me, that's the problem of our economic models. In our economic models, we have no resource constraints. We have no price for the natural resources.
Yeah, yeah. I guess that what you're thinking about is that in the same way that people have proposed for years, and some countries have implemented some forms of a carbon tax, a carbon price, one can think of a price for basically every resource that gets used, particularly those who have bad consequences for the human.
So, do you think that markets can solve this problem? I think you're very much convinced market economist. So, do you think that markets can solve this problem?
I'm a strong believer of market-based mechanisms, but I am also fully aware that uh, those mechanisms can fail at providing the solutions we want as human species. In this conversation, just in this conversation, we talked about transmission lines, and there we know that the government intervention is probably um, always required. So that is not a market-based solution for that problem. But more generally speaking, about um, the, the use of natural resources, uh, the example that we're just talking right now is that in the absence of a carbon market, a carbon price, people take these flights from Paris to Barcelona because it's relatively cheap. So if we could put in place a market uh, uh, that shows you the cost of that trip on carbon emissions or other externalities, I think that people will change their behavior. And so, in that sense, to that extent, I believe that market mechanisms can be at least a partial solution to these problems.
I think it's not either or. There are sectors where the markets can be very good, but we shouldn't be biased. Markets is the panacea for solving all the problems we have. And so I think also as economists, we have to be more open and to see for other types of solutions, and maybe finding a golden middle where we could, or maybe not necessarily golden middle, but rather defining, okay, this is the sectors where the markets work. This is the areas where the markets don't work, and we should go maybe for planning economy instead, where we need a clear indication by the governments what we need to achieve. And then once we know the objectives, we can use the market mechanisms to make these objectives achievable.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a concrete example of what you just said, I think it's that something that we also mentioned here today is that renewables on their own are not profitable. And in many places, not everywhere, but in some places are not profitable yet. And so the government has stepped in. It has stepped in, giving subsidies for the installation of these uh, devices for the production. And that is breaking in some way the market-based mechanisms, right? It's someone uh, outside this market system that comes in and basically gives money for you to not lose money in the process. And so, do we consider that a good solution? I think we do. We want that incentive if it provides good outcomes. And I think that the use of renewables, to a certain extent, or to a large extent, they provide good outcomes.
And now the last question. What are your two most inspiring books?
I had a hard time coming up with an answer because many books came to my mind, and so I had to think really hard. And I think that at this moment in my life, there are two books that resonate frequently, quite frequently. So one of them is autobiography, Richard Feynman. The book is called The Life and Science of Richard Feynman. And I read that when I was in high school, I believe.
Is it a Nobel Prize in Physics? Is it the one you mean? Or
Yep, yeah, yeah.
oh, that's an amazing book.
It's an amazing book. It really inspired me. So I did my undergrad in physics and math, and I was I always remember some of the experiences that he uh, talks about in the book about studying physics and going through all those subjects. Very humble person. He always liked humanity a lot, and so I think that that's a fantastic book. And then the second book that resonates in my head these days a lot is a much recent book. So it's called When the Heavens Went on Sale. It was published just last year, so it's a very recent book by a guy by name Ashley Vance. And so it's a book where he talks about startups that work in the space industry. So he visits different companies around the world that have many different ideas on how to commercialize the space. And so on one side, it's a very controversial topic because we're thinking about in this podcast about natural resources. And I think that this book gets at that, but at a different level, like even mining asteroids and expanding our human activity even beyond our own planet. I also like the book because it makes you think about all these entrepreneurial people that are out there that are trying new ideas. They want to work out solutions for very challenging problems.
Thank you so much for taking time to think about these books. I think they're really fascinating.
No, thank you very much to you for the invitation. And it's always it's very nice to talk to you about all sorts of topics in economics and beyond.